when a fighter gets knocked out, then has a rematch, it usually goes the same way as the first fight, but in even more decisive fashion, especially when it's an immediate rematch. Now, most people just take that at face value and they say, well, he figured him out the first time, so the second time he knew what all his weaknesses were, and that's the reason he got the job done quicker. But more often than not, it's a lot deeper than that. What people don't consider is the psychological factors that are at play when there's a rematch, when the first fight ended by a knockout, especially in decisive or brutal fashion. Now, I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about. This one is from 2019. Kerman La Jara, a Spanish super welterweight. He was on a good run of beating European level fighters like Bradley Skeet and Frankie Gavin. Then he ran into David Avanesian and he was stopped in 9 rounds in that fight. Now, he rematched Avanesian later on that year. It wasn't an immediate rematch. He did have a fight in between, but the two fights were relatively close together, both, as I say, in 2019. But as you can see, the rematch ended even faster than the first fight. Avanesian didn't go 9 rounds this time. He got stopped in 1. And that's typically what you see when there's an immediate rematch or a rematch very soon after the first fight, like this one, where somebody gets knocked out. They get knocked out even quicker second time around. To give you some historical examples of this, Julian Jackson, and again, this wasn't an immediate rematch, but it was Julian Jackson fighting Gerald McClellan the first time. Jackson was the champion. McClellan knocked him out in 5 rounds in brutal fashion. It was a brutal fight. Both guys got buzzed in the fight. McClellan came out on top and decimated Jackson in the 5th round with a vicious right hand followed by a left hook. Jackson got up. McClellan finished him off against the ropes. About a year later, when Jackson had had several tune-up fights in between, I think it was almost a year later to the day, they had a rematch and Gerald McClellan knocked Jackson out in 1 round. It wasn't even competitive. The first fight was. The second fight was a blowout. A more famous example would be Mike Tyson when he fought Evander Holyfield on November 9th, 1996. In the first fight, Mike Tyson was a massive favorite, 25-1. He was running through the heavyweight division again. He knocked out Peter McNeely, Buster Mathis Jr., walked through Frank Bruno in the rematch, destroyed Bruce Seldon in 1 round. Holyfield was seen as over the hill, past it, washed up. He'd had health problems. He'd been stopped by Riddick Bowe. He didn't look good in his comeback fight against Bobby Ches. This was not expected by most people to be a competitive fight. People actually saw this as a bit of a cherry pick for Tyson because Holyfield was a name, but most people believed his best days were behind him. But Holyfield sprung a massive upset. Now, Tyson in the rematch, I remember staying up with my younger brother till the early hours of the morning and watching the Tyson Holyfield rematch live. I watched both fights live. But what struck me in the rematch, me and my brother both said it out aloud when we saw it, was Mike Tyson at the face-off, because this was the face-off for the first fight. Look at Mike Tyson's face here. Pure confidence, pure menace. He truly believed he was going to walk straight through Evander Holyfield. That's him looking directly into Holyfield's eyes. Look at the look on his face. A few months later, for their rematch, this was Mike Tyson's face. He's not looking into Holyfield's eyes. And that's significant because Mike Tyson was a guy who would always stare down his opponents to try and intimidate them, to try and get in their head. That's what he would always do. That was his thing. Some fighters don't care about trying to stare down their opponent. So if you see some fighters who are not looking in their opponent's eyes, you can't really read too much into it because they never look into the opponent's eyes. But Mike Tyson would always stare into his opponent's eyes. I'm talking about Tyson when he was champion. But in the Holyfield rematch, which was an immediate rematch, he couldn't look Holyfield in the eye. And me and my brother were like, he looks scared. He can't look him in the eye. That's not the usual Mike Tyson. And of course, Mike Tyson basically fouled his way out of that fight. People talk about Holyfield headbutting him and all this kind of stuff. Mike Tyson was one of the dirtiest heavyweight champions in history. Look, Mike Tyson was tremendously exciting, very talented fighter, and he'd be a problem for any era of heavyweights. But he was a very dirty fighter. Mike Tyson would regularly hit people after the bell, hit people when they were down, and this is in his prime, before he lost to Buster Douglas, before prison. He would hit fighters when they were down, he would hit on the break, he would hit after the bell, he would throw low blows, he was reckless with his head. This was Mike Tyson, okay? So for people to say that him biting Holyfield was justified because Holyfield was a little reckless with his head is completely absurd. Teddy Atlas, and I know Atlas is not popular among Tyson fanatics, but Teddy Atlas actually predicted in the build-up to the Tyson-Holyfield rematch that Tyson would foul his way out of the fight. I remember him saying it. He said, watch out for Mike Tyson trying to do something dirty to get himself disqualified and get out of the fight. And that's exactly what Mike Tyson did. Why wasn't he able to beat Holyfield in the rematch? Was it just a physical thing that Holyfield had his number from a technical point of view? No, it was also a mental thing. Tyson had thrown everything that he had at Evander Holyfield in that first fight. In the second fight, when he started throwing big shots at Holyfield and nothing was happening again, Holyfield was pushing him back from the first round. Tyson got intimidated. That's what happened. He felt like this is just history repeating itself. Because after the first fight, Tyson went away and got himself in fantastic condition. Other than the Peter McNeely fight, this is aesthetically the best physical condition I ever saw Mike Tyson in during his entire professional career, was the Holyfield rematch. He was in tremendous physical condition, ripped to shreds. And he came out in the first round with the classic Mike Tyson side-to-side head movement, using his jab. But his mind wasn't the same after that first Holyfield beating. Holyfield took something from him. The same way that Avanesian took something from Kerman La Jara mentally. He took something from him. These guys were traumatized. They were dealing with the demons, the ghosts from the first fight, the trauma. They hadn't gotten over it by the time the rematch rolled around. Same thing for Julian Jackson against Gerald McClellan. So while the victor of the first fight gains confidence, and of course there is an element of him knowing the opponent's weaknesses now and being able to get to them quicker, but there's also a very big element of the previously beaten fighter not being sufficiently psychologically healed from what happened first time around. And therefore they usually capitulate much more quickly in the rematch. Same thing happened for Mike Tyson in the Holyfield rematch. Just look at his face again. Look at the comparison. That's him staring Holyfield down in the rematch, in the first fight, excuse me. That's him looking at Holyfield in the first fight at the stare down. And that's him not looking Holyfield in the eyes for the rematch. He couldn't look the guy in the eye. Significant for Mike Tyson. Now, one of the reasons that Teddy Atlas predicted that Mike Tyson would try and foul his way out of the rematch was because he knew Mike Tyson, obviously, but there were some telltale signs in the first fight. Now, any of you can go to this particular video. You can see here, it's on a channel called Global Sport. And it's an excellent copy of the first Tyson Holyfield fight. I want you to go to the 33 minutes and 2 second mark. 33 minutes and 2 seconds. Go to that exact mark in the video and press play. And you are going to see Mike Tyson in the 7th round deliberately try and headbutt Evander Holyfield. Well, he did headbutt Holyfield. He literally comes forward, then he launches the top of his head into the side of Holyfield's face. It's not some accidental headbutt. It's not just Tyson trying to come in low and not looking where his head is going. No, he deliberately actually turns his neck to the left as he moves forward to try and headbutt Holyfield in the face. And he successfully does it. But after headbutting Holyfield in the face, Tyson recoils and starts wincing. Because at this point, in the previous round, Tyson received a cut above his eye. And in the 7th, he headbutts Holyfield in the face. Then he recoils and starts grimacing. And he wants the doctor to have a look at his eye. He had a tiny nick over his eye. It wasn't a fight-ending cut. Mike Tyson was trying to get himself disqualified in that. He was trying to get the fight stopped basically in the 7th round, or maybe get Holyfield disqualified, or try to get the fight stopped on a cut and then they could go to the cards. That's what Mike Tyson was trying to do in that 7th round. I noticed it at the time when I was watching the fight live. Teddy Atlas also noticed it, which is why, one of the reasons why he said in the lead up to the rematch, Tyson's going to try to file his way out of this fight, which is what he did. Again, Mike Tyson in the Holyfield rematch was dealing with the demons from the first Holyfield fight. And it was an immediate rematch, so he didn't have enough time to get his mind right. But in the first Holyfield fight, he was also dealing with the demons from the Buster Douglas fight. Tyson started getting deja vu. When he threw everything at Holyfield, Holyfield was still there punching him back, wasn't scared or intimidated. He was getting flashbacks from the Douglas fight. This fight right here let me know that Tyson, even though it was several years later, he still hadn't gotten over the trauma of what happened to him in Tokyo in February 1990. He never got over it. Because against Buster Douglas, Mike Tyson took his beating like a man. At no point during the Douglas fight did Mike Tyson look for a way out. Try and headbutt Douglas and then get the fight stopped on a cut or whatever the case may be. No, Tyson never looked for a way out in that Douglas fight. But in the Holyfield first fight, he did in that 7th round. Although that was the only time he looked for a way out, was in the 7th round. He did turn away from Holyfield in the 11th when he was getting a beating right before he got stopped. And some people might say he was attempting to quit then. But certainly in the 7th round, that was a blatant attempt by Mike Tyson to get the fight stopped. Okay, and in the rematch, it's exactly what he did. He got the fight stopped because he bit Holyfield several times, and it gave him plausible deniability. He could say, oh, well, Holyfield didn't knock me out. He fouled me, so I bit him. That's a way of getting out of the fight without getting knocked out and trying to retain some of your credibility among your fan base, I guess, which Mike Tyson has incredibly managed to do with regards to this fight. And look, I was a huge Mike Tyson fan, and I still am a fan of Mike Tyson from an entertainment perspective in particular. One of the most entertaining fighters I've ever seen in my life, in any weight class. But the mental scars and perhaps even mental weakness showed up in the Holyfield fights. So the point I'm making with all this is that most fighters are unable to overcome the psychological trauma of a knockout defeat sufficiently to win an immediate rematch, or even a rematch a year later when they've been knocked out the first time. It takes a special kind of fighter to be able to do so. When Lennox Lewis got knocked out by Oliver McCall, he didn't get an immediate rematch with McCall, even though he wanted one. He had to wait a couple years later until the WBC belt became vacant. Then he got his rematch with McCall. But when Lewis came back, he fought a journeyman called Lionel Butler in his comeback fight after getting knocked out by McCall in 2 rounds. Lennox Lewis was gun shy as hell against Lionel Butler. You could see that he wasn't anywhere near as confident as the Lewis prior to the McCall defeat. It took Lewis a long time to rehabilitate himself mentally. Most of the boxing publications at the time were talking about how Lewis was gun shy and that he wasn't committing to his punches like he used to. And they were absolutely right. Because even somebody as mentally strong as Lennox Lewis was traumatized psychologically, and it took him time to get over the anxiety that he was hit with after suffering that knockout defeat. And it's not just the fight itself, it's all the pressure surrounding the fight. because Lennox Lewis was written off. You know, Lennox Lewis was this big rival of Riddick Bowe. There was talk of Lewis fighting Mike Tyson if Tyson came out of prison. I mean, Lewis was going to fight Tommy Morrison prior to Morrison losing to Michael Bentt. So Lewis was linked to all these big fights. He was a world champion, all this kind of stuff. But yet there was a lot of skepticism about him. There was a lot of hating from the American press towards Lennox Lewis and the American public. So when he came back, I mean, it felt like the entire boxing world other than the UK, and back then the UK was only a tiny fraction of the boxing world. It felt like 90% of the boxing world wanted Lennox Lewis to fail. So he had a lot of pressure on his shoulders. He was coming back in America, where he'd been, you know, ridiculed even before he lost to McCall. So when you're dealing with all that kind of pressure and you're getting back in the ring and trying to perform, it's different. So when you actually have to get into the ring to have an immediate rematch with no rehabilitation fights, the pressure is even more. Yeah? And there's pressure from your fans, there's pressure from your haters, there's pressure from the television company, there's pressure from your promoter, there's pressure from your manager, your family members, pressure coming from all over the place. If you were rematching a guy who'd knocked you out in sparring a couple months ago, and you were sparring him again, you probably wouldn't be so nervous in the ring because it's behind closed doors, nobody's watching, there's no pressure, it's just another sparring session. You may perform better in that situation. But when it's a high pressure, actual professional fight in front of millions of people, and there's just so much on the line, you can't even imagine the type of pressure psychologically that you have to deal with on top of the trauma, the ghosts, the demons of what happened to you in the first fight. So when we come on to Anthony Joshua, of course, the fact that he was able to defeat Andy Ruiz in that rematch was testament not so much to Anthony Joshua's boxing ability, because I always knew and said that Anthony Joshua had the technical ability to outbox Andy Ruiz. I said that in multiple videos after he lost the first time, that he definitely has the technical ability to outbox Ruiz, no question. It's just whether he has gotten over the psychological trauma of the first fight. That's what it all came down to me. It wasn't about whether AJ had the technical ability, the athleticism, or any of that. Not even the chin, because AJ had fought bigger punches than Andy Ruiz before. It's whether he could do what Kerman La Jara, Julian Jackson, Mike Tyson couldn't do, and overcome the trauma of being knocked out first time around. Anthony Joshua passed that test. It's a test I didn't know whether he would be able to pass, but he did pass it. Because that kind of pressure and those kind of demons have an effect on your body. That kind of nervousness, if you can't control it, it can get the better of you. That kind of anxiousness, it can actually fatigue you when you're overly anxious and worried about what's going to happen. And Anthony Joshua, prior to even the first Ruiz fight, his stamina had seemed a bit suspect several times. So when you add the insane levels of pressure he was under for this rematch, plus the ghosts of the first fight, I mean, the fact that that didn't take a toll on AJ, I mean, I think in the middle rounds it maybe was taking a little toll on him. But he managed to get over that hump and win the fight by a landslide on the cards. AJ ticked a box from a psychological point of view for me in that fight. I've seen so many people who, let's just face it, they don't like AJ. And they're looking for any way to discredit him and trash him and what have you. They're only interested in focusing on his weaknesses because they don't like him. They want to ignore all the strengths. But anybody who looked at this rematch and has any knowledge of boxing will have been impressed by the fact that AJ held it together psychologically, because that's what it was all about under that insane pressure. He held it all together. So from a technical point of view, was there still mistakes from Anthony Joshua? Yes, there was. But this was a fight in AJ's head against demons as much as it was against Andy Ruiz. And understand that most fighters in AJ's position, they don't win that fight with those demons in their head in immediate rematches like this, especially not under this kind of crazy pressure. They don't win that fight. And we're talking about some very, very good fighters, the likes of Julian Jackson, the likes of Mike Tyson. These are not ordinary guys. And they didn't win that psychological battle. AJ won it. You know, so he deserves credit for what he did in the Ruiz fight. Mentally, probably even more so than physically. I was more impressed with that than with his technique or with his strategy, because it was the obvious strategy that he had to employ. People saying that he needed to go forward and have it out with Ruiz. I mean, what brand of crap were they smoking? He always needed to keep it moving. Anybody who'd studied Andy Ruiz's fights over the years would know that that's the exact blueprint of how to beat this guy. You don't stand in front of him. You don't exchange with him. You don't try and prove who's the tougher, who hits harder. You don't fight Andy Ruiz that way. You take advantage of the fact that he's a short guy with slow feet and he relies on you being high volume or at least throwing enough punches for him to counter. That's what he relies on. Well, don't give him that. So AJ's strategy was, for me, a predictable strategy. It was more what he did mentally that impressed me. And there's a box tick there. I think from a mental point of view, AJ can grow from this fight. You see, it's not just, again, a tactical thing or a strategic thing whereby he can revert back to this style of boxing if need be. It's more the fact that he knows in his mind that if he applies himself, he can overcome adversity. Even like this, where he got humiliated in the first fight, written off by so many people, laughed at, all the memes, all the trolls, all this kind of stuff. Under an insane amount of pressure that none of us can even fathom if you haven't been in his situation. None of the heavyweights in the division right now can fathom the pressure AJ was under because they haven't been under that kind of pressure. But he was able to overcome that. It takes a special kind of person to be able to do that. Most fighters can't. Yeah? So, moving forward, I think AJ is going to grow a lot mentally. I think he's going to gain a lot of confidence in the long run from this. And I think he's going to become a better fighter. One of the things which anybody with any common sense will have noticed about AJ is that he's an extremely fast learner. This is a guy who went into the World Amateur Championships and was the least experienced person in the tournament and came away with a silver medal in Azerbaijan, went all the way to the final and lost by a single point to the home favorite in front of their president. He was literally a novice thrown in at the deep end with the best amateurs in the world who had hundreds of fights. And he'd only had, 20 odd fights or something at the time, maybe 30 fights. So he has a history of learning very fast, of being thrown in at the deep end and managing to swim. So even though he does have technical and physical shortcomings, his mentality is clearly special. And I've talked about fighters who have a special mentality before, like when I was making videos about Errol Spence on the way up. On the way up, Errol Spence's mentality was different from most other welterweights. It just was different. He didn't think like the other guys did. And you could see it in his demeanor. Whenever he would talk in interviews, he had a different kind of mentality. AJ, same thing. Different kind of mentality. Which is why he was thrown in at the deep end early on in his pro career, but the likes of Deontay Wilder wasn't. Wilder was still fighting cab drivers in his 18th, 19th, 20th fight. AJ, I think, has had 24 fights now. Deontay Wilder was still fighting cab drivers in his 24th fight. It took Deontay Wilder much, much longer to reach championship level. He wasn't ready. He didn't learn as quickly as Anthony Joshua learned. That's why they moved him so incredibly slowly. And even when he became champion, was kept well away from Klitschko. Didn't have any unifications with the likes of Parker or AJ. Could have had a unification with Klitschko for the vacant WBA. Stayed well away from all that, even as champion. Because this guy, Deontay Wilder, doesn't learn as fast as somebody like AJ. I'm just telling you the facts here, people. If I'm wrong, explain to me why Deontay Wilder was moved so slowly. That's not to say Wilder's not a good fighter. He's a very good fighter. But the point I'm making here is a lot of people are underestimating Anthony Joshua's ability to learn quickly and to overcome adversity, his mental fortitude, because he's proven it time and time again now. The fact that some people are overlooking it, rubbishing this performance, saying he fought scared and ran and all this kind of business. I mean, you clearly have no knowledge of the fact that most fighters in his situation crumble. When you're fighting an immediate rematch against the guy who wiped the floor with you first time, most of them wouldn't be able to win the rematch in any way, running around the ring or standing. They lose in more decisive fashion than first time. So, anyway, just a little history lesson for those of you who are maybe newer boxing fans, and I guess an exercise in psychological analysis, because a lot of fans seem to think that fighters are like robots. They never seem to factor in the psychological elements at play. It really amazes me. That's when you can spot somebody who's never boxed before in their life. When they talk about fighters and never factor in the psychology. Because if you've been in the ring and you've fought and you've taken punches and you've won fights and lost fights, you've been hit with big shots, you understand how it feels. Not just physically, but psychologically and emotionally. When you've had rivalries with certain fighters, gym wars, rivalries and actual fights, you understand the psychological things that are at play. But people who haven't boxed, most of them, some of them do understand because they have a certain level of emotional and intellectual intelligence. But a lot of people, they give themselves away. You could tell these people never laced up a pair of boxing gloves in their lives and actually had a fight because they never factor in the psychology and the emotion and how difficult it is dealing with those things. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.